Okay, we're recording now.
Good. So, good afternoon. My name is Lorena Lombardozzi. I'm based in the economics department here at the Open University. And I'm here to chair this second session of 2022 of our monthly International Development and Innovation Seminar series. We are delighted to have with us today our doctoral researcher, Charlie Whetham. And he's both a PhD student at the Open University, but also a development practitioner. So he will give us very interesting insight about the world of vaccination. And also Theo Papaioannou, Professor of Politics and Innovation and Development here at the Open University, will be our discussant. So we will start the presentation and then we'll open the floor for Q&A. The video, as usual, is being recorded, so for those who don't want to be featured, they can either ask questions in the Q&A and ask to remain anonymous, or they can easily raise their hands, and I will and Heidi will unmute you so that you can ask your question directly. At the moment you're automatically muted, but we will we'll activate this tool during the Q&A. Please follow us on Twitter using the handler @intdev_OU. And so yes, today we're gonna discuss about vaccinations. The title of the presentation is a very catchy one, as we were noticing before starting the seminar: vaccine shots and silver bullets. And without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Charlie. Welcome, and thank you for accepting our invitation to present your very interesting and relevant research with us today. Thank you. So I'll mute myself and put my video off.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lorena. And just to say, so the development practitioning that Lorena referred to has been both at DFID and at Gavi, where I work now. So I did want to highlight in advance that the views I express here are my own and do not necessarily reflect Gavi's. So with that, let's make a start. So hopefully you can see an FT title, and please flag if you can't. But what the title flags is that facing increasing cynicism at the legitimacy and effectiveness of aid and an environment of austerity, the international development industry has seen innovation as a means to increase effectiveness and efficiency. So, for example, 80% of the Development Assistance Committee donors feature innovation explicitly in their ambitions. The definitions I've included here are typical in highlighting the nature of the aims that donors have for innovation. So the sense is quite often that these are the silver bullets for development to which our title refers. Across donors, the private sector is widely seen as the partner of choice for innovation. And that's because they perceive the private sector as an engine of innovation, as inherently innovative, agile, and adaptive. Now, of course, academics have appreciated since Schumpeter that it's consumer demand that pulls firms towards unmet needs and prompts them to innovate so that they can meet those needs more effectively and thus to increase the market share. But in a development context, the well-functioning market, which this is dependent upon, for effective information exchanges between actors, can be very weak, so that the international private sector would assess that the costs and the risks of investing in the research and development for those markets is not exceeding any potential return on sales. So consequently, we see the 10-90 gap, by which only 10% of the global expenditure on health research and development is into those issues affecting the 90% of the world's population living in low-income and middle-income countries. The primary donor response to this post-World War II was this policy of technology transfer, which donors equated development with industrialization and saw the transfer of technology from high-income countries as a way to enable low-income countries to catch up. But some fundamental weaknesses emerged in that model, and it was subsequently understood that this is because even codified knowledge, scientific knowledge, requires accompanying tacit knowledge, which is much harder to transfer because it's embedded in economic and historical, cultural, complex contexts. Subsequently, Schumacher's model of appropriate technology was driven by a central principle that innovation must be aligned to the institutional context and the capacities and the resources of its users. Within the low-income country context about which we're talking, this was understood as requiring innovations to be low-cost, labour-intensive and infrastructure-independent. But the model was unpopular with low-income country governments who saw it as an implication of inferiority, and it never overcame those perceptions. So how then do donors foster innovation? And these are the research questions which I've used to drive the research. And essentially, they relate to areas in which the specific characteristics of donors or of international development differ from the market-based context in which private sector-led innovation occurs. So philanthropic aims, as opposed to being profit-oriented, in weak markets rather than well-functioning ones, with intended beneficiaries, which are difficult to engage, and fourthly, with a wide range of donor types and characteristics. The systems of innovation approach, which has emerged over recent years as being the kind of primary, preeminent model of innovation, understands or explains innovation as being a collective process in which actors interact to combine elements of existing knowledge, influenced by the institutional environment surrounding them. So consequently, interactions are as important for innovation as the actors themselves. The sense of system conveys the idea of interconnected elements, bounded and operating as a whole, which is more than the sum of its individual parts. But it's not constructed or governed or manipulated, but it's more self-organized, and it behaves and evolves without direction. The first system of innovation model was at the national level, where innovation is facilitated by shared institutions and linguistic and cultural commonality and geographical proximity. And this conceived a triple helix of government and universities and firms being particularly central to innovation. But it's not clear that that model stands up when one or more of these triple helix dimensions is too weak to sustain the model, as is the case in low-income country settings. So the national system of innovation model is like to be a necessary part of the donor fostering of innovation, but not sufficient. A second major refinement to the model was the sectoral system of innovation, focused on more specific set of knowledge, artifacts and actors, with the spatial distribution varying across industries based on those. This again, however, puts a lot of reliance on the role of firms within the group of actors, and it lacks, again, specific tools to tailor the model to weaker market settings. And then my final point here is a recognition of the fact that globalization over the past few years has further extended the need to incorporate an understanding of global dynamics and structures and actors in a way which builds on these two earlier models. One of the models that does that is the global innovation system, and this is the conceptual framework that I've used for the research, and it tries to build upon the relevance of the national level institutions, etc., and the emergence of new globalized networks. It also explicitly accommodates both science, technology and innovation type knowledge and the doing, using and interacting knowledge in a greater recognition of a continuum than earlier iterations of the innovation systems model did. Usefully, it also introduces the concept of valuation resources for innovation, which are market access, financial investment, and technology legitimacy. So the last one of these is maybe merits some explanation. The technology legitimacy relates to the embedding of an innovation within institutional structures or environments. So what's useful is that it therefore doesn't assume as an underlying premise that there's a functioning market in the same way that earlier iterations of the innovation systems model did so. So it provides for alternative means of generating value through the other valuation resources of technology legitimacy in particular. So that offers greater potential for us to accommodate an innovation system that is based primarily around philanthropy than economics. Let me just, how can I move on? There we go. So this is an illustration of a hypothetical global innovation system. So you can see different levels of resource formation, so global, national, and in this case also regional level. And each has a focus in this illustration. The market formation, MF, knowledge creation, KC, investment mobilization, or technology legitimacy. So you can start to see the idea that different subsystems within an overall system will generate particular resources for innovation. The institutions and actors and interactions within each system, that subsystem vary though, and they serve to provide a distinct comparative advantage for each of those subsystems. And it's significant that the national level is a particular, remains an important level within this model. The model also incorporates the concept of structural couplings between different subsystems. These arise when there's an overlap between actors or networks or institutions between them. And as an example, the authors Binz and Truffer give an example of a multinational company which connects knowledge from one region to another or to the global level. They don't explicitly include donors as an example of that, but the model has potential to be applicable in our case, I hope. The other element around the conceptual framework that I wanted to highlight was the taxonomy of institutions that I've used. So whereas various authors have proposed a distinction between formal and informal institutions, Scott's taxonomy has three different pillars that you see here: regulative, normative, and cognitive. The regulative are the sort of explicit formal rules. Normative ones confer responsibilities and duties and rights. And then it's the cognitive rules which provide a framework for attributing meaning, such as beliefs or communication tools. This is useful because I anticipate that within international development, it's going to be useful to distinguish between normative and cognitive institutions in a way which other models lump together as being informal. Just quickly to touch on methodological aspects. So with scientific knowledge important to the sector, represented in the kind of role of research and development, captured in the Sustainable Development Goals and other more specific aspects of the industry, and the economic basis of a lot of the poverty assessments, but also the innovation systems model highlights the importance of interaction between actors and their perceptions and interpretations. So there's a bit of a sort of historic mismatch between the ontology and the epistemology, which those two reflect. This combination then of a realist ontology, scientific realist ontology, and a relativist epistemology is the position of the critical realism conceived by Basker. This realism is approached critically in the sense that there's a recognition that empiricism is imperfect. So being able to make explanations necessitates a deep understanding of the structures and relationships of the social world with which it interacts. And the approach, the qualitative approach and an abductive explanatory logic follow from that philosophy. Because the empirical data that I've used is in-depth and qualitative, and it relates to a complex contemporary setting, it lends itself well to a case study approach. A single case study is perhaps not ideal, but is justifiable when it's a particularly unique case or particularly explanatory case, as I'm going to argue is the case for global immunisation within international development. Global immunisation I've selected as a case, firstly, because it's a top priority for donors. Secondly, because it's got a high rate and range of innovation, which means that the donor approaches have the opportunity to be refined through multiple iterations, and therefore more likely to reflect idealized approaches on the part of the donors. And they also reflect within this sector a wide range of combinations of types of knowledge, which across different types of interactions and spaces, which I think increases the potential to apply that more broadly within international development. But I've further improved the generalizability through the use of multiple embedded units of analysis, which are the donors. In this case, I selected relevant donors on the basis that they were significantly funding global immunisation and had a particular investment in innovation. So these are the three donors who came out of what was, in fact, a more kind of analytical selection process. I probably, for the sake of time, won't run through and anticipate that you know about Unicef, but in particular, its high investment in immunisation staff at the country level, about Gavi and the extent of its sort of central role within the industry, and then Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the magnitude of its financial resources at its disposal. Hang on a sec. Right, so just quickly then to give you a sense of each of those, the key kind of features of each of those donors. Let me just check on time. Okay. So
you have more than 20 minutes.
Okay, good. I think I'll need it. Thanks. So I wanted first to look at the institutions that affect each of the donors in particular. The first one is a cognitive one for Unicef, which is this understanding that innovation is critical for donor impact. They describe it as being to enable them to better deliver programs beyond business as usual. They also link it to wicked problems, which is sort of intractable challenges, which sometimes donors start to do, and that these challenges are evolving. Secondly, is another cognitive institution that technological innovations are the most important. So you see evidence related to, at times an expansive definition of innovation as new thinking to old problems. But when it comes to the rub, Unicef does quite often display a preference for technological innovation. And I've illustrated the way in their examples and in some of their criteria for funding. In fact, there was a 2018 evaluation of innovation, which I draw from a fair bit, which found that Unicef was focused too greatly on technologies to the detriment of other approaches. A third institution is a normative one, which specifies that innovation should be rooted in the local context through the participation of intended beneficiaries. And this is in order to ensure that they're responding to priority needs. Again, the evaluation found that this as a general principle is well embedded in Unicef, but not so well applied to innovations. There's an interesting quote there about, country level perspectives back on that, about it. Innovation not just equaling gadget. Unicef's organisational characteristics are also very relevant to their role in innovation. The first one is their ability to operate at scale. And of course, this relates primarily to their procurement through supply division of the bulk of vaccines procured by or for low-income countries. I'm upping the pace by which I speak, by the way, because I'm a little bit worried about time. The second one, although on scale, there is some discussion about, internally about the extent to which that focus on scale as opposed to piloting is the right balance. Secondly, significantly is the centralization of innovation in Unicef a few years ago under a single Office of Innovation, which had an unintended consequence of other staff seeing it therefore as being something that they weren't expected or equipped to do any longer. And worse over, conveyed the sense of that this centralized unit was particularly over-branding or selling its ideas. Nonetheless, there remains an underlying, majority of UNICEF staff who feel as though they're contributing towards innovation in UNICEF. Thirdly, and very significantly, is UNICEF's distributed decentralized structure. Earlier on, although I skipped over it, the 124, I think, country offices that UNICEF has is a very significant dynamic to its ability to engage on innovation, and it it emphasizes that it is well suited to working with beneficiaries to find solutions, and indeed the evaluation confirmed that this is its most significant feature in terms of institutional architecture for innovation. And I've referenced this sense of critical friends with the government, so that partnership not just with beneficiaries but with the government. In terms of interactions, you see some of the same themes that I've touched on innovation, on institutions and organisational characteristics, also playing out in their interactions with others. This term that UNICEF used, being local, emphasises their claim of a particular ability to link global and local problem solvers. And it talks about its capacity, its access at the national level, but also its engagement on technical discussions at the global one. The second set of interactions is that the relationship with the host government, which, as you'll appreciate, is critical and a source of tension sometimes between, its ability to play that honest broker role that we alluded to a minute ago, and the sense that it's expected to sell or push innovations which have been identified at the global level. The third set of interactions is you start to see some reference to an ecosystem and of UNICEF trying to convene or coordinate other actors within the broader system in order to ensure complementarities within the provision of innovations in the sector. To conclude the UNICEF bit, I mapped UNICEF then against the resource modes of the global innovation system. So vertically, you see the kind of knowledge mode, and then horizontally the valuation mode. So science, technology, innovation is still a major driver in terms of the organisation's emphasis on learning and explicit knowledge, codified knowledge, and its interest in technological solutions. But this is evenly balanced by UNICEF's strong country orientation and the associated DUI knowledge. Then in terms of valuation resources, they're highly customized in terms of working hands-on at the country level to make innovation happen, rather than it being standardized across the range of markets in which UNICEF works. So very quickly, moving on to Gavi. So again, I've highlighted here, similarly to UNICEF, a reference to an ability particularly to drive scale. And again, it relates to the procurement of vaccines globally, in this case, paid for by Gavi, and its ability to use that financial clout to lever both manufacturers and the governments, who benefit from the purchase of vaccines on their behalf. Just see if there's anything else to say there. The sequitur of that, of the kind of consensus that that's a real advantage for Gavi, is that potentially they're not so good at some of the piloting type innovations. And we start to touch on that with the next point. There is a sense that Gavi's particularly early stage innovations are influenced by the duality of its aim to mobilize from the private sector both innovation expertise and financial resources. So you see a quote here that talks about the potential that might lead to trade-offs, or has led to trade-offs between those two. And then thirdly, as an organisational characteristic for Gavi, is the fact it's an alliance, which is both public and private, draws and incorporates the range of those perspectives, and coordinated by a single secretariat, 400 odd strong, based in Geneva. But within that alliance, then you do see some specific, like, common roles which emerge around, for example, UNICEF's on procurement, WHO's on standard setting, the secretariat, the Gavi secretariat, on overall coordination, and interestingly, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as being a driving from behind. I'm going to keep going. I could say more on all of this, but we're going to run out of time. Institutions. So you see a similar to UNICEF reference to innovation being critical for development impact. I won't keep going on that. You see a similar reference again to innovation being led by the private sector. Of course, in Gavi's sense, it's slightly more nuanced by the fact that the private sector is part of the Gavi Alliance more broadly. And then again, you see reference to the inclusion of beneficiaries as being an important normative institution. Gavi doesn't engage with these institutions in the same way UNICEF does, though. I'll talk about it a bit later. UNICEF engaged with them very substantively. You know, you see direct correlations between these and the decisions made by UNICEF on one or another. Gavi engaged with them more to use it as an opportunity to highlight Gavi's successes. I'll come to that when we talk about institutions more broadly. Right, Gavi's interactions with other actors. So Gavi talks about trying to broker knowledge. You know, its role as Secretariat for an Alliance gives it an opportunity around that. In practice, the brokerage is often still quite top-down. So it's less the case of sort of demand-led brokerage in this case. Partly related to this second interaction, which is Gavi's aim to leverage or harness the private sector, to kind of bring its resources, its expertise and its innovation into the shared space around global innovation, immunisation. So it's done that very well around vaccines and vaccine attributes. So, for example, patches, you know, innovative patches or means to deliver vaccines other than syringes, and also cold chain equipment. But it's trying to bring the same logic to a broader set of private sector partnerships with industry leading organizations, which is less kind of technically oriented. It's more about the virtue of the fact that they're big private sectors. Plays to the point I mentioned earlier about the tension between resource mobilization and innovation through the private sector. Thirdly, government buy-in. So again, in contrast a bit to UNICEF, the Gavi perspective is very much around the government in particular, but reinforces again the importance of their government ownership and engagement in that process, particularly in terms of the sustainability of scale up at the country level, following, you know, the Gavi provision of funding, for example, for proof of concept of innovation. Again, I've mapped it against the same axes, and you can see then a similar recognition of the STI-based knowledge, but not to anything like the same degree as UNICEF around the doing, using, interacting type knowledge. And again, I mean, in this case, a much more balanced split between customized and standardized knowledge, innovation valuation resources, sorry, in which case you see, you know, a high degree of standardization around the vaccine provision, the cold chain equipment, initiatives for innovation, but a much more customized requirement for use of resources around, for example, some of the other private sector piloting that Gavi does. So it's a bit of a kind of story of two different kind of modalities within Gavi in terms of how they operate. Finally, I want to turn to Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So the primary organisational characteristic I wanted to highlight is Bill and Melinda Gates, and the fact that they retain a very strong influence over the organisation, both in terms of kind of priorities, in terms of decision making, in terms of values, and immunisation and innovation both benefit particularly from that. I did want to mention, of course, that association is sometimes tempered by, there was a 2001 antitrust case against Microsoft. So there's occasional criticism about that relationship as well. I mean, not least because of Bill's background in computing, but the entrepreneurial and scientific positivism is very strong within BMGF, brings a kind of focus on data, a focus on the private sector in particular, and the kind of the rigor of evidence-based decision making. The risk is it's seen as being too much a sort of reductionist approach to, you know, here's a bit like the sort of silver bullets approach. Here's an innovation that could solve it, whereas of course larger structural causes of poverty are going to need more radical political engagement of country systems. Lastly, the fact that BMGF is a foundation brings with it a much narrower accountability than would a bilateral government agency to a taxpayer, or a UN agency to contributing states, and allows the foundation to have a much higher risk appetite. These together allow it to be much more nimble in terms of its decision making, its speed to respond to opportunity, and the nature of the opportunities which it's willing to embrace. In terms of interactions, you see reference to convening, and again, BMGF highlights in particular the attempt to bring in the private sector around that. And in fact, various academics talk about the advantages that a foundation has to do that, particularly a foundation which is funded from resources generated through the private sector in terms of the common culture and language and people. The second was the market, and again, I've referred to Bill's sort of market-oriented approach in particular. And so you can see very much an engagement by the BMGF in working with the private sector under a 5 to 10 year or 10 to 15 year time horizon to work in particular this bridge between the laboratory and development. So very consciously positioning itself upstream, using a range of tools to to prompt or initiate that sort of investment on the part of that private sector. The third one, and this is worth highlighting, is the way that BMGF is very much more than a source of money. So it initially took a deliberately independent position within the set of actors in the industry, but seems to have realized quite early, 2002-ish, that this wouldn't enable it to achieve the scale of impact it desired, and needed better to actually influence the range of other actors. So you started to see after that reference to not just funding of those organisations, in particular the large vertical health funds, but you also see the demand for that coming with representation on those organisations' boards, strategic secondments of staff, and the funding of specific posts, and in technical engagement. There again is some criticism of this, because there's a concern that with the narrow accountability, this influence looks like it means that public policy is disproportionately skewed by a very small number of people. The institutional engagement is linked to that. So the short text around this is that BMGF's institutional engagement is one which it complies in order to build that influence around the actors who are bound by these institutions. So I've given some examples around the aid effectiveness, for example, and the international governance. But the sense very much is that this is a strategic decision by Gates in its engagement with these institutions in order to increase its influence. This is the final sort of empirical slide, characterization, which is around BMGF's position, as one would expect, very much STI based, standardized in the sense that its tools to engage with the private sector are very standardized in that sense. They're not at all engaged with the country level beneficiary type engagement and customization that others would. All right, so just quickly then, institutions. So what I did was then look at those institutions that emerged from the 3 donors separately, map them, and you can see a mapping against the national level and the global level. And you can see the division into regulative, normative, and cognitive institutions. You can see you can see a close relationship between the regulative institution at the national level and one at the global level, if you look across the lines. And I've argued that this, this serves to strengthen the argument that there's an underlying common system onto which the national and global are subsystems. But you don't see it at the cognitive level. In fact, there you see some potential tension between an institution at the national level and one at the global level. Different organisations engage with that in different ways. So I've referenced some of that. So in Unicef, we see some conflict and contestation between those different parts of the organisation who are more engaging with institutions, these cognitive institutions at the national or the global level. In Gavi, we see this what are called co-optation in terms of the way Gavi replays these institutions for its own arguments. And in Gavi, in BMGF, we see a conforming to them in a strategic way. I have mapped then all of the three separate organisations against this common scale. I will, however, though, keep moving for the sake of time. I wanted, as I move on to talk about valuation resources, to kind of look in more depth into the market shaping and the specific, if you look at the left-hand column, way in which individual valuation resources are used in different ways to shape the market. I haven't got time though to go into the detail of that. I've then mapped that, give me a second, against the, so not in this time, I've mapped the same axes, not against the individual donors, but to try to show how they are using these resources in different phases of the innovation development cycle. So you see the invention, which is, to use the sort of Schumpeter conception of the stages of innovation, the way in which these donors are engaging to use science, technology, innovation, knowledge to engage with the private sector to invent in a way which is using standardized, or let's say sort of abstract type knowledge. It then moves to a phase, and again you can see UNICEF more involved in this application phase, whereby those inventions then are tested or piloted in a country context, where, as you would anticipate, the DUI-based knowledge becomes much more to the fore, as does the requirement to customize the valuation resources which that entails. Before then, the diffusion or the scaling up phase, emerges to be a much more standardized, more sustainable way of using these valuation resources, still, balancing the STI and DUI types of knowledge. And this tries to characterize the set of donor actors as a whole, and the way in which they are taking innovations, fostering those innovations through that cycle, rather than thinking in individual donor terms. I'm probably, looking at the time, going to have to cut things. Let me jump to this slide.
Yeah, we have like 5 minutes left.
5 minutes. All right, I'll conclude on this one. Yeah, thanks, Lorena.
Thanks.
Oh, there's so much I haven't said. So this then is how I've then tried to map those actors against the sort of the structure of a global innovation system, global innovation system in global immunisation. So I wanted to highlight, therefore, you see the structural linkages that Gavi then provides down to the governments at each of the national levels, and uses those to kind of advance either the customized piloted innovations or the standardized scaled innovations with government, uses its financial resources generated at the global level from its replenishments to pay for those introductions at the national level, and thereby generating, particularly through the piloting, the technological legitimacy that moves them through to scale. UNICEF, you see, similarly has structural linkages down between subsystems, but in this case to UNICEF offices. And in fact, the dynamic is much more one of not financial resources flowing down those structural linkages, but actual knowledge, DUI knowledge in particular, flowing up to the global level based on the intelligence generated at the country level. So that sort of technology legitimacy in particular, that countries feedback, then UNICEF replays and feeds into the innovation generation at the global level. BMGF, you see, isn't reflected at the country level, essentially, but actually serves to extend the boundaries of the global subsystem through its proactive engagement with actors who aren't currently part of that global system, or indeed a national system. Lorena, Theo, I think I should probably leave it there, but happy to take questions later.
Great, thank you very much, Charlie. That was like very systematic and coherent, so it made sense. I leave the floor to Theo, who is actually, I mean, I haven't said that, but he's your lead supervisor, right? So I guess, yeah, he will provide a very interesting insight on this research and further, yeah, kind of expand the reflection to more for the
Okay, thank you, Lorena. I'll probably put my camera off though, because I've got
yeah, Theo sometimes has problem with the signal,
yeah.
So yes, he's still there.
Okay, yeah. So I'll try to be rather brief, but I'll try to be a little bit provocative as well. So I think first of all, just to say the question of how donors in the area of immunization foster innovation is quite interesting. It's quite timely as well. So far, existing research suggests that donors provide the funds for innovation, but in a way they leave innovation to others, right? So they don't innovate themselves. But I think what Charlie is arguing is that this is not the case. I mean, innovations come from donors. Innovations, donors themselves not only really innovate, but Charlie is arguing that they are part of a global system of innovation that is complex and is constituted by other subsystems. So I would like to say a few words about that last point. Innovation theory hasn't really paid enough attention to global innovation system. Why? Because innovation theory has been rather consistent with the nationalist tradition coming from Friedrich List, that says that innovation basically should emphasize important at the interactions happening at national and local level, and perhaps sectoral level, not that much at global level, because whatever interactions take place at global level, they are not as systematic as the interactions taking place at national level. Yet the cases which Charlie presented, the Gates Foundation, UNICEF, and Gavi, demonstrate that global innovation systems do exist, but they don't exist in general. They exist on particular issues like the global immunization. Why? Because in global immunization, there is fragmentation of knowledge, and therefore issues of knowledge and gaps can only be resolved through global cooperation and interaction. And that's why I think they exist through subsystems of actors and networks and institutions which play their role in mobilizing the system, providing solutions to these kind of problems. So that's one point. The second point is about the fascinating, I think, comparison that Charlie provided between the different donors. Now, clearly, each donor has a different approach to innovation, and they have different organizational characteristics which influence their innovation performance. So we've heard that Unicef, for example, has characteristics ranging from operating at scale to decentralized structure. By contrast, Gavi's capabilities range from scaling innovation globally to convening different actors to play the game of coming up with new vaccines. The Gates capabilities range from raising philanthropic funds for innovation to taking perhaps more risks. So all these are very, very important differences, and of course, the impact on their performance when it comes to innovation. I think what Charlie didn't say, and I would like to put that forward as a question, is what exactly is the common ground for these organizations? Okay, they all innovate, but what do they have in common? And my guess, my answer to that question would probably be that donors have some sort of attitude towards institutions, right? Yes, they have different institutional approaches to national and global institutions, but if I want to be a little bit provocative, I would say that they have something in common, which is that they never challenge those institutions much. They try to be in line with those institutions. And as I said, of course, they engage differently at the institutional level, but they don't seriously challenge them. So one of those institutions, of course, is intellectual property rights. And the global market for vaccines. So donors don't seem to seriously challenge, for example, the unfair outcome of the market diffusion of innovation. And we have, of course, the recent example of the COVID-19 vaccines. In conclusion, I think Charlie has revealed some fascinating differences, as I said, between donors and demonstrated the existence of the global innovation system. I think he has been very, very gentle with his critique of the traditional innovations theory, because I think he could actually be a little bit more critical of the failures of the traditional innovations theory to understand innovation in a systemic way as it's taking place at a global level. So perhaps this is something that Charlie could develop more. In Charlie's conclusions, I think one of Charlie's conclusions is that, and he said that also at the beginning, donors see the private sector as primary source of innovation. I think this can be debated given what he has presented to us, because I think that it doesn't take into account the fact that eventually, donors innovate themselves. Do they really see innovation only in the private sector? There is one question of how donors really shape markets. Given their attitude towards institutions and regulatory frameworks, how do they shape the markets? And for me, there is a third question about how donors manage to root innovation in local contexts. Do they do that, or do they actually fail to take on board local needs and aspirations? And what about helping industrial capacity in certain local contexts? I think these would be the three questions which I would ask, particularly with regards to IPRs as institutions, and also impact on local context. Thank you.
Thank you, Theo. Thank you, Theo. All three very interesting questions. I'm wondering whether Charlie wants to have a little moment to reply, and then we open the floor to the audience.
I don't mind. Why didn't you open the floor? I mean, I'm sure they'll have things they want to ask, and then I can respond.
Yeah, but I mean, it's your opportunity to reflect on what has been there. All right.
Okay. I don't mind. Whatever you'd rather. Yeah, you want me to?
Yeah, I mean, I'll open the floor, but I don't have any immediate questions, okay. So I will just give some people, time to reflect. So yeah, we have one question from Maureen, but yeah, maybe like then I'll maybe give the let Maureen ask her question. I don't know if you know Maureen. I'm certainly know you do. It's like she's our emeritus professor in economics, and she's been working on public health for many years in sub-Saharan Africa in particular. So I'm sure she will give you amazing feedback. But yeah, let me give the floor to Maureen then, and then please have the opportunity to I think it would be very interesting for us also to hear your perspective of what has been raised. So yeah, let me give like a round of questions then. So Maureen and then Joseph. Hi, Joseph. Nice to see you. Yes, do you want to just unmute? Yeah, Maureen.
Okay, I think my connection's a bit dodgy, so forgive me if I don't put the video on. I could try it. No, maybe not. Charlie, I'm really sorry. I missed the first 10 minutes. So I was in another meeting. So my apologies. So if you've said the answer to these questions, then that's fine. Just tell me so. I've got two related. They're both about conceptualization, really, and they're both questions. One is about the global versus national distinction. I think you're using, would this be fair? It's a question, using global to mean money from rich countries, institutions based in rich countries, basically. But there are some big institutions which are enormously influential in the way immunizations actually get accessed, which obviously don't fit that. And I mean, for example, the Serum Institute of India, which is the major, biggest, low-cost suppliers of vaccines to the world, and of course, Unicef buys volumes of it. They've been innovative in all kinds of ways. They've been absolutely crucial in the immunization in India, and so on and so on. I mean, they're important enough, I would have thought, to be sort of seen as global. But I think they count as local because they're out there, not in here. And I'm just, how are you defining global and local? And are you really happy with the way you define it? And is it about size, or is it about people being rich? That's one. And then the other one, which is very interconnected with it, let me just use the Serum Institute twice. It's an obvious example, which is the private sector. I thought you were, maybe this isn't true, but what it seemed like is you were using the private sector rather as a sort of block, there's the donors and then there's the private sector. But the private sector is obviously hugely diverse. It's really important where it's based. It's really important who owns it and how they're responding to the challenges of innovation. And again, the Serum Institute of India is an absolute classic in the sense that, it's had a lot of government support, but it's private sector, it's India, it's huge, it's arguably the private sector. How do the divisions within the private sector fit into your story about some kind of single, question mark, maybe not single, global immunization innovation system? I'm not clear, really. I'd love to know.
Thank you, Maureen. Very interesting questions. Charlie, if you agree, we have also Joseph wants to ask something, and then I give you the floor to debate them. Yeah, all of them. Hi, Joseph. How are you? You should. We can't hear you. Just make sure that. Joseph presented last week his work on Mozambique. He's a very well written journalist, but also our research fellow, and he writes on the resource course in Mozambique. I actually promised to read his paper. I still haven't had the time. If you want, you can like type, and so in the meantime, Charlie will ask the questions. But yeah, please type you in the chat box, and we will be happy to share with Charlie your questions, Joseph. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, thank you. And by the way, of course, happy for people to follow up with me afterwards, whether directly or through Theo or you. Thank you, Theo, and thanks, Maureen. I'm just going to take Maureen's questions first, actually, because they're sort of more foundational. So I think I should define global, but I definitely meant to include, in this case, you know, the full range of WHO qualified vaccine manufacturers, whether they be based in Europe, the US, India, do you know what I mean, or Indonesia, for example. So, but you're right. It's that points to a much bigger question about how does one set those boundaries to the global. So I was struck. The other thing that came to my mind, I've seen reference to the fact that I can't recall the year now, but of BMGF funding, something like 80% of the main bulk of grants provided by BMGF goes to recipients who are based in the US or Europe. So I do think there's definitely stuff to unpick there about the boundary setting, but myself had implicitly understood it to be inclusive of SII and those manufacturers are operating at that level. But thank you for that pointer. Agree also on the private sector. It's I think it's a gap probably in terms of conceiving it. I think of vaccine manufacturers as a block, but of course they're relatively homogenous. One could conceive of a much broader range of private sector, and indeed donors do. I didn't really touch on some of the grassroots initiatives that in fact all three donors have. The grand challenges for BMGF, Gavi's Infuse exercise, and Unicef's venture funding are all very much startup oriented. So I could see potential for me to get into more depth to unpick quite what those interactions and the nature of their engagement with innovation looks like compared to the global manufacturers of vaccines and other. So thank you for those pointers. To Theo's points, you're right. They don't. The politics of donors and their engagement with governments and with each other and with their funders is not. I could be more political probably about it. I touch on it, but didn't today. The donor role brings with it expectations and feelings of obligation from the government point of view, and I think the same could be said around institutions, and the extent to which that's sufficient, therefore, the role that they do, as opposed to a role that were to challenge unhelpful institutions more dynamically. The local context is, again, I didn't really touch on it, but the UNICEF, for me, when one talks about, Theo, you asked about how they root innovations in the local context, there's a lot of material in terms of from UNICEF's ability to engage in a range of sort of settings to reach the most marginalized in countries, for example, and to try to make those links to different degrees of success. But that's a part of the overall system provided by UNICEF there that is unique, really, when I look at the other actors that I analysed. And shaping markets, I didn't have time to cover today, but there's a lot there. Should we need to go into that later? Can I go back to you, Lorena?
Yeah, thank you very much, Charlie. I think Joseph has typed in the chat box his question. I will read it out loud for those who don't have access to the chat box, and then you'll reply. And also Theo might want to add something if he wants. So this is a Technofix innovation. I'm old enough to remember primary health care and the Alma Ata conference as 50 years, which was an amazing example of the diffusion of soft innovation. Does this model support a move to centralized technology against diffuse local innovation being shared? So,
does Theo want to come in first, and then, or Theo, shall I go?
Yeah, go ahead, and then Theo. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, the first thing that I think when I read this is the kind of the what's the word, like the innovation prompted by resource deficiency. You know, the whole body of work around innovation from the grassroots innovation, resource poor innovation, and the fact that actually what I'm seeing from donors is occasional reference to it, but no systematization of that within these set of donors. You know, so the sense that they are, for whatever reason, whether it be their reach, their drive for scale, and not engaging with the capacity building of innovation capacity at the country level, or the sort of the harvesting or the nurturing of innovations from the country level, from resource poor settings, you know, to scale them up. They seem to go as a default to the centralized innovation that you refer to as being produced by those interlocutors they are encountering at the global level, much more so. I hope that answers the question, but Theo, did you want to supplement?
Yes, well, I mean, I wanted to say that the focus on the three particular donors and their approach to innovation, by definition, is more techno-fix than anything else. Simply because they think of innovation in R&D terms. And that's very clear, especially about donors like Gates, for example, because these are the kind of innovation they promote. Now, this, of course, raises the question to what extent we can generalize from these three donors about the kind of innovation that they foster. I mean, global immunization is R&D driven, but at the same time, there are local institutions in place, and there is a requirement of local innovations in order for the R&D driven innovations to work. Now, we haven't. I mean, there is a gap there. Obviously, you haven't looked at this type of innovation, despite the fact that you looked at elements of inclusiveness. And this is one criticism towards those donors, which basically tend to overlook the kind of innovations which are not R&D, but they're very important for the R&D innovations to be promoted at local level. And overwhelmingly, all the three donors, I would say, even Unicef, try to think of innovation only in techno-fix terms. I guess you can put something there. I would take it as a criticism of the donors, the three donors approach to innovation, actually.
Sorry, do you want to add something more, Charlie?
I was going to say, and actually it touches a bit on Maureen's other point about sort of innovation in other settings, and because of course it depends whether I try to explain innovation in international development more broadly, or am focused solely on global immunization, because I think the sense of the nurturing grassroots innovation, and the recognition of all of the innovation that's taking place in emerging economies or middle income countries is a clear dynamic within the broader international development. But aside from the SII and other, specific examples of those players in those settings who are able to engage at the global level, neither is a particularly strong, dynamic or characteristic that's come through on the global immunization side of things. So I think maybe I need to be clearer about that sort of specificity.
Yeah, for those who are not reading the chat, so both actually Joseph and Maureen made a point about so Maureen said, I think the focus on the 3 donors is missing a lot of innovation production in middle income countries, like Latin America, North Africa, Egypt, and Joseph makes the point of Cuba. But yeah, I think it's it would make, it would be interesting to make explicit the reason why you're focusing on that. That doesn't mean that you don't see the relational approach to agency in low-income countries, but it would make sense to extrapolate what is the reasoning and the logic behind such a selection, no? And Maureen asks, Gavi and Unicef focuses on low-income countries?
They do. So Gavi only provides subsidized funding to the poorest 73 countries, based on, in fact, the World Bank's categorization as low income. And again, UNICEF obviously has offices in middle income countries too, but they're and procures on their behalf. But the scale of their technical engagement on immunization is much greater in low income countries also.
Yeah. No, that's yeah, very interesting process, and also power relations. You know, it's I guess that's also an issue that could be, yeah, of course, analyzed, but you can't really focus on everything. I'm wondering whether there are any other questions from the audience. We have some minutes left. I don't know, or in the chat box, I'm checking. No, so I might want to ask a question. Can I? Yeah. So it's about data, and so your PhD, your doctoral research, from what I understood, is kind of a qualitative text analysis, almost a narrative approach, no, of what is the, you know, yeah, innovation and diffusion system. So I was wondering whether you could tell us a little bit more about how do you manage to access information about this very important topic, and it's a little bit connecting then to the politics of data sharing of the vaccination and immunization, because at least, I mean, it's you know, I have a window to, I mean, I'm based in the UK, but I'm also from Italy, so I look at all this you know, discussion about data sharing, and it's this global cooperation, which I don't see. I mean, it strikes me what Theo said about, you know, this is a global innovation dynamic, because the pandemic is a global problem. But at the moment, to me, it also gives, it makes very clear that there is nothing cooperative about the way the you know, data has been shared, the record and track systems, the immunization, intellectual property rights, all the bits of competition are, I mean, maybe in a soft way, but still there. So, you know, so I was wondering, so these two sides of the information, so how did you literally get data? So it can be public reports or policy analysis, and also if you could tell us a bit more about this, you know, cooperative versus competition approach to innovation.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. Let me just note that one. By the way, as I've been thinking about the comments, you know, I realized that even the title global immunization isn't going to be sufficient, you know, because I need to convey the sense of the, you know, the subsidized almost global immunization, the sense of the, you know, global immunization as a donor-led exercise as opposed to nationally owned process. Just looking at the comments from Maureen and Joseph in particular. So just to close out on that, I think that's very helpful. Thank you. Yeah, in terms of so in terms of data, firstly in terms of data, yeah. So I used an approach which was both key informant interviews and one which was documentary analysis, and then triangulation between those two. I tried to capture informants from within the 3 donors, but also from those organisations who would be able to kind of have a perspective which was critical and external, including in particular recipient governments, to try to make sure that I was kind of capturing their key perspective on that, and manufacturers, a small set of manufacturers as well. So it has been dependent on the data that has been publicly available, and it differs very much between the different donors, as one would expect, and what the informants have been kind of capable of saying and willing to say. So yeah, I think it actually also touches on a boundary point, actually, as I realise it now. Even in the data gathering, I've had to draw the line at some point around how far I go to explore, and I think that is really important to draw that linkage. So I'll do that. The second half of your question, actually, around the kind of nature of the engagements, I see brings to mind a phrase I saw, co-opetition. Now I can't remember the reference, but the sense that these organizations are working in the same space where there is a competitive element, but they are also cooperating. Now that may be on the degree of a share of the sort of technical level know-how, whilst the sort of the know-what is kind of more safeguarded by intellectual property. Or in terms of donors, it plays out in terms of the fact, and I didn't really touch on this, but could, the way that innovation is seen as being media attractive. It's a tool that the donors also use to tag a lot of stuff that they use to raise their own sources of revenue. So it actually becomes the donors themselves cooperate within a system of innovation, but they are also actually an element of competition between them, to target their private sector partnerships with Coca-Cola or whoever, and then to use that to generate their own resources. So there are various kind of ways in which this co-opetition plays out in the system.
Thank you. Is Theo there? I don't know if he wants to add something.
No, as I said, because of the focus of this research, I think it's obvious that there are aspects which and questions which couldn't be addressed. I mean, I fully take the point about the missing innovation countries like countries in Africa. On the other hand, it's not clear that the involvement of those donors is there. So the focus on those donors is a focus on global players in a way, but global immunization is one thing. The other thing is what's happening at in the local context, right? And immunization that takes place without really the involvement of those donors, right? And the knowledge that is produced there. But one doesn't really exclude the other in a way. So the fact that it's happening in local context doesn't really mean that there is no global system of innovation where those actors are getting involved. And I think perhaps we should acknowledge that in parallel there are many other systemic processes taking place at local context. So I think Charlie has addressed some of the questions, but I think all these comments have been very helpful in order to think a little bit some aspects of the research, which I think perhaps remain a little bit weak. Not so much about the conceptual framework, but as I said, acknowledging that there are other processes in place when it comes to global immunization. So it's been very, very helpful for me as a supervisor, but I guess Charlie as the one who's doing the research. So we'll have a look at this. So thanks very much.
Great. Yeah, I think it's yeah, it was very helpful for all of us. First of all, because I mean, we actually learned a lot about what is going on behind the scene of the major donors. But also, I mean, for you, it's like, I think it's you know, set the boundaries, as you said, and making explicit, you know, the selectivity process that you know, yeah, you used, and also, yeah, the devil's in the details. So all these big words might need to be, you know, yeah, explained in the context of your research. So if there are no any other questions, I don't know if Charlie wants to comment, or do you want to ask questions to, I mean, those who've been providing very
No, I mean, I just want to emphasize my thanks. It's been very helpful. Feels a bit like a sort of
revival.
but
yeah,
but really useful for that. So thank you very much, and I'll follow up. I think probably with some of you as well. Thank you.
Great. Yes. Yeah. So Maureen and Joseph, yeah, we will have emails on our website. So thank you very much, everyone. Our next seminar will be on the 16th of March. Seth Schindler from the Global Development Institute at University of Manchester will present on emerging geographies of the Second Global Cold War. So it sounds very, very interesting about the US-China geography of trade as well. It will touch upon very, very relevant issues. So I will then, yeah, say goodbye. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and I'll see you to the next seminars. Thank you, Heidi, and thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the afternoon. Bye.
Thank you.